Hey everyone, welcome back to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast. I'm your host, Lance Smith, and it's Tuesday, which means it's time for another Contradictions episode. If you're new here, this is a show where we dig deep into those seemingly contradictory details in Scripture and uncover the truth behind them. So let me start with a question to get us thinking. Did Jesus, Mary, and Joseph flee to Egypt after Jesus' birth, or did they head straight back to Nazareth? And why do the gospel accounts of Matthew and Luke appear to tell different versions of the story? Are these accounts truly at odds with one another? Or is there a way to make sense of it all? The Skeptic's Annotated Bible points out what it claims are contradictions in these stories. But here's the big question. Could these differences actually offer complementary perspectives instead of conflicts? Stick with me, because by the end of today's episode, you'll see how this story not only fits together, but reveals something truly extraordinary about God's bigger plan. Let's jump in and take a closer look. The Skeptic's Annotated Bible lists a verse that suggests Jesus, Mary, and Joseph went to Egypt after Jesus' birth, and another that suggests they went to Nazareth after Jesus' birth. Let's explore each using the New Living Translation to gain a clearer picture. First, let's look at a verse that suggests they went to Egypt after Jesus' birth, and this is Matthew 2:14. That night, Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother. Now, let's look at a verse that suggests they went to Nazareth after Jesus' birth. This is Luke 2:39. When Jesus' parents had fulfilled all the requirements of the law of the Lord, they returned home to Nazareth in Galilee. All right, let's talk about the journey of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph right after Jesus was born. Here's where it gets interesting. They traveled to both Egypt and Nazareth, but at different points in time. If you've ever noticed what seems like a contradiction in the gospel accounts, don't worry. It all makes sense when you dive deeper. Matthew and Luke each focus on different parts of the story, and when you piece them together, the timeline actually works out. And most tellingly, the Skeptic's Annotated Bible leaves out Matthew 2:15, which really adds necessary context. So let's unpack that a bit more. First, the journey to Egypt. So let's dive into Matthew's account of what happened after Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Here's the setting. Joseph gets an intense warning in a dream. He's told to pack up and take Mary and baby Jesus to Egypt because King Herod is plotting to kill the child. BibleStudy.org has an article, Journeys of Mary and Joseph, which gives this description of their travels, and I quote, Herod's cruel actions fulfill a prophecy regarding the slaughter of innocent children. That's Jeremiah 31:15. Their journey from Bethlehem to what is Egyptian-controlled territory, which was outside the jurisdiction of Herod, was at least 65 kilometers or 40 miles. After Herod dies in early 4 BC, Joseph has a dream where an angel tells him it is safe to return to Israel. Mary and the family's trip to and from Egypt is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy, which we see in Hosea 11:1. They soon began their travels back to Judea and Bethlehem, end quote. All right, interestingly, according to this article, the travel was to Egyptian-controlled territory, which was just a mere 40 miles away. But that still leaves the question of the timing of the journey. Most likely, this happens right after the Magi visit, the wise men who came to honor Jesus as the newborn king. For this, we'll look to the April 26, 2021 article, Jesus' Birth and Escape to Egypt, from BibleMapper.com, where they write this, and I quote, Perhaps as much as 2 years later, astrologers called Magi came from the east to worship the newborn king of the Jews, because a star in the heavens signaled that he had been born, and it directed them to Jerusalem. This is Matthew 2:1-2. The Magi asked King Herod where the child was, and he asked the leading priests and teachers of the law, who pointed them to Bethlehem. So the Magi traveled 5 miles south to Bethlehem, and the star directed them to the house where Jesus and his family lived, end quote. So it appears Mary, Joseph, and Jesus remained in Bethlehem with family, as we learned last week, for 2 years after Jesus' birth. So when you think about all this information, the timing and travel to and from Egyptian-controlled territory, this is where the story gets even more interesting. Their escape to Egypt wasn't just about staying safe from Herod, it also had a much deeper meaning. You see, it fulfilled an ancient prophecy from the book of Hosea, which says, "Out of Egypt I called my son." And when you read forward to Matthew 2:15, which is left out of this contradiction in the Skeptic's Annotated Bible, we find this verse, "And they stayed there until Herod's death. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet, 'I called my son out of Egypt,'" end quote. How amazing is that? It's like every piece of the story is part of a bigger plan, all connected in ways that are just incredible to think about. Now, let's look at the return to Nazareth. All right, so here's what happens next. After King Herod dies, Joseph gets another visit from an angel in a dream. This time, the message is clear. It's safe to return to Israel. But when Joseph hears that Herod's son Archelaus is now ruling in Judea, he is understandably cautious. Joseph's fears about living within Judea are confirmed when God sends him a warning in a dream. Okay, now, who is Herod Archelaus, and why was Joseph cautious or even afraid to return? For this, we will return to the article, Journeys of Mary and Joseph, where they tell us this, and I quote, "Like his father, Archelaus rules with tyranny and cruelty. John Gill's exposition of the Bible states that one time he sent his entire army into Jerusalem's temple at Passover in order to kill 3,000 men suspected of sedition. The family, instead of going back to Bethlehem, continue their journey and go northward to their hometown of Nazareth, which we see in Matthew 2:22 through 23. The city is part of Galilee, which is ruled by another son of Herod the Great named Herod Antipas. This son had a slightly less violent disposition than Archelaus," end quote. So rather than returning to Bethlehem, Joseph makes the decision to take Mary and Jesus up north to Galilee. That's how they come to settle in Nazareth. It's fascinating, isn't it? Throughout this story, we see Joseph responding to divine guidance, each decision shaping the path of this remarkable journey. And this leads us to reconciling the gospel accounts. The Gospel of Luke does not mention the flight to Egypt, focusing instead on the family's return to Nazareth after fulfilling the requirements of the law in Jerusalem. This apparent discrepancy can be explained by understanding that, 1, the Gospels were written with different audiences and emphases in mind. 2, Luke's account may be summarizing events, not providing an exhaustive chronology. And 3, the silence of Luke regarding the Egypt journey does not negate Matthew's account. The exact timeline is not specified in the Gospels. Again, the major point is this. As stated in the article, Bible Contradiction, Did Jesus, Mary, and Joseph Go to Egypt or Nazareth? And this is from December 7th, 2016, where it says this, and I quote, "We must not make the chapter in Matthew and Luke to be a greater conflict than it ought to be. Looking at Matthew 2 and Luke 2, we see that both are in agreement that Joseph, Mary, and Jesus eventually settled in Nazareth. This is seen in Matthew 2:23 and Luke 2:39, end quote. So what's the takeaway? The journeys to both Egypt and Nazareth aren't contradictions. They're pieces of a larger, beautifully connected story. They highlight a family guided by divine warnings and fulfilling ancient prophecies at every turn. It's a powerful reminder of how God's plans are purposeful, even when they seem complex or uncertain. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into the travels of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. If you found this episode enlightening, I'd love for you to share it with a friend. Your support helps us continue exploring the fascinating complexities of Scripture together. As always, we love hearing from our listeners. Please join our Bible Difficulties and Answers Facebook page, where you can interact with me and other followers of the show. You may also reach us at our website, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers.podbean.com, or you may reach out to me directly at our email address, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers@gmail.com, with any questions, comments, concerns, fits of righteous indignation, or just to say hi. I'm always glad to hear from our listeners. Also, please like and subscribe to this podcast. Tell a friend or two as well. And also, write a review and give it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Podbean, Spotify, YouTube, or any of your venues of choice. It really does help get the word out about the most amazing book ever written. Again, I'm Lance Smith. Until next time, I wish you good luck, good health, and God bless. So long, everybody.